Hey, multi income woman. Welcome back to Empower Her. This podcast is for ambitious women who are building multiple income streams and refuse to choose between financial security and personal freedom. I'm Priya, and if you're here, you're probably juggling a career, side hustles, maybe even consulting work, content creation, or building your own business. You're diversifying your income because you know that's how you create real financial power and flexibility in your life. But here's something that we cannot ignore: AI is changing the game for all of us. Whether you're freelancing, building a business, creating content, or climbing the corporate ladder while doing it all, AI is already impacting how you work, how you earn, and the opportunities that come your way. Today's conversation with Katrina Ingram, one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics globally, is crucial for every multi income woman. Because if you're building multiple revenue streams, you need to understand how AI can either amplify your efforts or create invisible barriers you don't even see. We're talking about AI bias in hiring and promotions, how to use AI as an empowerment tool in your business, what ethics washing really means, and why having agency of choice in an AI driven world isn't optional. It is essential for your financial future. This isn't just theory, this is about protecting and growing the income streams you're working so hard to build. So let's dive in. Katrina Ingram. Welcome to Empower Her. Awesome.
Thanks so
So
much. I'm
Katrina
happy to be
Ingram,
here.
she is an educator, she's a speaker, she's an advisor, and she has her own business, which is called Ethically Aligned AI. Um, and I'll let you expand more on, kind of your background and career and how you ended up in the path that you're on now.
Yeah, well, it was a journey, Priya, I have to tell you. So it started back in about 2017. So I actually had spent a lot of my career in media, in fact, working in radio stations, worked for CBC in Vancouver for a little while. And then I came out to Edmonton and worked for a really fantastic indie music station here called CKUA. So spent a lot of years doing that. But around 2017, I had this moment where I thought, I want to try something new. I'm not sure exactly what that is. So I decided I was going to go back to school as a midlife student. And I went back to the University of Alberta to do a degree in communications and technology. And so it was while I was there, I wandered into this lecture. It's being given by an AI researcher. So people might not know that Alberta, Edmonton, is one of three places in Canada that has an elite AI research institute attached to it. So I wander into this lecture, and it's this researcher who's talking about AI gone wrong scenarios. So this is 2018, and he's already talking about all the risks, all the harms, all the things that could go wrong. And it really caught my attention, so much so that I thought, this is really what I want to do my research on. So I focused my research on this whole area of applied AI ethics, and I graduated in the middle of the COVID pandemic, 2020. And I thought, I want to keep going with this work, but I don't really know who's doing this work. And then I thought I have to maybe start a business to start doing this. So I launched this business in 2021, not really knowing where it was going to go. But I got lucky. I got my first contract in 2021 to do some educational AI literacy courses. And so I started there, building that out. And then, of course, ChatGPT comes along in late 2022. And all of a sudden, everyone's talking about AI and they want to know about the risks and the harms and how to do things responsibly. And that just really kind of blew things up. And so here we are sitting here in 2025 having these conversations because now everybody needs to know about this. So that's a little bit of my backstory and kind of how I
That's
wound
very
up doing the
interesting
work that I
because
do.
back in 2017 or 2018, if I remember, I don't remember reading or even like hearing much about AI and especially ethically how you can use AI and then things related to that. So that's very interesting that, you ended up in a lecture and then from there on, that's a very future forward thinking that you had at that time. So yeah, that's really, really impressive.
Well, I love to tell everyone it was a plan, but actually it was a little bit accidental. And I think life's like that. Like you make these plans for what you're going to do. And sometimes you get thrown a curveball and it throws you in a different direction, but maybe that was what you needed to do all along. And so I like to kind of stay open to that idea of like, what are the possibilities, even as we're kind of moving
Yeah,
forward with
yeah,
whatever our plan
absolutely.
happens to be.
And then, what was it like starting ethically aligned AI? Obviously jumping from, corporate roles to, a business. It's a very tough transition, and then also it's very challenging. So how was that transition for you?
Yeah, it can be very lonely for sure, especially when you're a small business and you're doing almost everything on your own. And it was very different than having a team to manage. So when I was doing more of those corporate roles, I was in a management position. I had a team. I had people who did things like accounting that I don't like to do, but now I have to do those things myself. Yeah, it's been so those are maybe some of the things that are challenging. On the other hand, what I really love, so I actually manage a radio station that is almost 100 years old. It's going to be 100 years old in a couple of years. And when you manage an institution that has a lot of history, you realize that you can't, it's hard to change things very quickly. And so, one of the exciting things about being an entrepreneur, especially of a new company, is this blank slate, this idea of being able to create things. And that's especially true in this industry because there is no playbook, there is no set of rules that you're having to follow. You're kind of making things up as you go and learning as you go. And if you're the kind of person that likes to do that, and I think many people who start businesses are like that, then this is a really exciting field to be in. So it's kind of that balance of, yeah, there's some things that perhaps are, we could call them the negatives or the things we don't like to do, but
No,
then there's a lot of
that's
excitement as
absolutely
well.
true. And then let's talk a little bit about, when it comes to women and the field of AI. So when we look at, when it comes to building AI or, building these systems around AI, what did you see in terms of like representation from your end?
Yeah, so I want to tell you a little story. I want to take you back in time a little bit to the 1950s. So this is when AI was becoming a thing. Computer technology is brand new at this point in time. And it was really interesting to think about the role that women had in the world of computing. There were actually women who did this job. They were known as computers. And what they did is they did a lot of the math and the multiplication, addition, all this kind of stuff that we would think a actual physical piece of hardware that we call a computer would do today. So these women were known as computers. They worked for these big organizations. And in fact, there's a movie called Desk Set, which really illustrates this well. So Katharine Hepburn, she's kind of the leader of this team of women, and they're doing this job, doing all this computation for a big company. And the company is about to get a big IBM mainframe computer. So the whole story is about workplace automation. And it's such a great story for right now because we're facing those same fears. So women were actually part of this whole industry. But what happened is that women got pushed out of this industry. And there is a whole history of how this happened. But basically, why it happened is that as that work, that software work became known as less administrative and more about coding, and it was seen as important. And the men started coming in, and there started to be this kind of gender role division where women got pushed out of doing that work. And we never really recovered from that moment. I mean, I think we went into a situation where men took over that work essentially. And then women have been trying to move back into representation, equity in the STEM fields for quite a long time. And so right now we see a very inequitable situation still, unfortunately. I've heard the numbers of anywhere from as low as 10% to as high as 30. I pick 20 as kind of a happy medium for representation of women in the field of artificial intelligence. But when you look at who actually gets funding to launch companies, companies need VC funding. It's something like 2 to 3%. So it's very, very low. And so all of that, it's really interesting just when you reflect on the role, women were there, they got pushed out, and we never kind of got back
No, that's very
into that same
interesting,
level
and
again.
thanks for sharing those numbers because yeah, that kind of like shows what the representation is right now. Um, why do you think that matters? The representation of women in AI.
Yeah, so there is a quote that says, "Who makes the technology shapes the
Hmm.
technology." And I think that's very, very true. So if you don't have the opportunity to make a technology, and especially to make management level decisions like owning a business, that kind of thing, then I think your ability to shape that technology becomes really constrained. And I think that matters also for the tech that we get. So the technologies that we get come from a particular type of person who has particular vision about the world. And if you ever wonder, like, why do we have this kind of why do we have so many of these, I don't know, food app delivery kind of services? I mean, maybe it came out because people really wanted that particular thing, and that was a lot of young men who don't cook, right? You think about practical things like that, and then all of a sudden we've got so many food app delivery services, but we don't have maybe some other kind of thing that might be really important for a different group of people. And so I think this idea of like diversity of who makes the technology is incredibly important. And when you have it really skewed, it doesn't give you the best
Hmm.
kinds of
Yeah,
technology that
that's
you could
absolutely
possibly
true.
have.
And when I mean, obviously, I hear about bias pretty much everywhere nowadays. Like it exists everywhere, and it's gonna exist, and we can't really do much about it. Obviously, we can try different things to make sure that it doesn't happen. And when I heard that there's also bias that exists in AI, I wasn't really surprised, but um, what kind of bias do you think exists in AI? And again, why does that matter as well for us?
Yeah, there's a bias called algorithmic bias, which is this idea that AI itself can exhibit biases from a bunch of different sources. So if we think about modern AI, it's built using a technique called machine learning. And that basically involves taking a whole bunch of data and then you're using algorithms. So you can think of an algorithm. Simple way to think about it is like a step-by-step set of instructions. So if you've followed a recipe before, you've kind of engaged with an algorithm. But these are computational algorithms. And basically, we use those algorithms to find interesting patterns in the data. So lots of data, algorithms, and then lots of computer processing power. So if we think about what if we didn't have really good data? So one of the data sets I like to share, and this will be familiar for Canadians, is the Prime Ministers of Canada data set. So just imagine in your mind who's been Prime Minister of Canada. And if you looked at that data set, you'd see only one woman in that data set of all the people who've been Prime Minister of Canada. You'd also see that everybody was white, and everybody, if you looked into their background, who are these people? You'd see a certain class or
Mm-hmm.
socioeconomic kind of category of person. And so if you
Mm-hmm.
think, okay, why does that data look the way it does? It looks the way it does because of all of these historical factors, all of these political factors. But let's say you took that data set and you wanted to train an AI system to figure out who's going to be a good leader. Let's predict the next good leader. You're going to get some really biased results because you're using a biased data set. And that's one of the ways that this
Mm-hmm.
happens is
Yeah,
because that data
I've
is
been
so
hearing
biased.
recently a lot if we take an example, like within when it comes to hiring. So, a lot of AI is being used now to, hire. So you have like, AI basically reading like resumes or things like that. So that's, I think, a good example of, where bias could show up, if I'm right.
Yeah, absolutely. So another famous story, kind of related to your example of hiring, is that of Amazon. So a couple of, well, maybe probably about 7 years ago or so now, they were trying to build a system that was going to streamline all of their hiring. And so what they used as their training data set was a set of data for people who had been really successful in that role, had applied to that role, and that happened to be a technical role. And I've just told you the story of how women got pushed out of technical roles. We never really recovered and there wasn't representation. So you can imagine how skewed that data set was. So they used this data set. And what they did is they created a really, really good gender discrimination tool. It would flag a resume and it would notice that, oh, you played on the women's volleyball team, or you went to this college that is a women's college, or the way you're writing, it seems to track and correlate well with what someone who is a woman might write. So I'm going to screen you out of this process and you're not going to get into the job application pool. And so that's the kind of thing that definitely can happen. And of course, it's really important that we don't have that happen in something like hiring, but people are adopting these
Hmm.
tools really
Yeah,
quickly and they don't
absolutely.
really
Yeah.
understand the risks.
Let's kind of pivot and talk a little bit about, ethics washing. So, I've heard of that term, but a lot of people haven't. So, can you explain to the audience what that is?
Sure. So it's sort of like this idea of greenwashing, which is sort of this notion that you can say something is green or sustainable when really it isn't. And ethics washing is kind of that same idea, but for ethics. And I think of it specifically when it comes to things like technology or AI ethics. So it's kind of this notion that, yeah, we're being responsible, we're doing good things, we're being ethical, when really you're kind of either fighting that or the kinds of things that you're doing are so surface level that they're not really making a tangible difference. And so it's something that I'm a little bit concerned about. One of the things I've noticed as someone who's been in this field since 2018, back then, very few people were talking about AI ethics, responsible AI. Now I see a lot of people talking about it, but it's almost like they're throwing the word responsible in front of AI, and that's their whole ethical approach, and then it's business as usual, and that concerns me. I'm really concerned about that because I don't want this term to be co-opted or used in a way that looks like we're not making
So,
meaningful
how
progress.
common would you say is that in like the tech industry right now?
I think it's really common because I think there's this acknowledgement that, yeah, we do need to be responsible. But I also see that the resources that are being put towards that effort are not there, or the people who are doing that work aren't necessarily being supported. And so when it comes to the real mechanisms that might actually move forward the kinds of changes I think are necessary, I see those things kind of being held back even as the story of responsibility moves forward. So I think it's something that we need to pay attention
Mhm.
to and figure out how to address.
So how would a person like me would be able to like differentiate between, like, if I see a company who is, trying to look responsible, or if someone is actually, putting their effort towards being more ethically responsible?
Yeah, it's really hard for the consumer. And this is why traditionally that's the role of regulators, right? They're the ones that look out for you as a consumer. I always say, imagine if you had to go to the grocery store and you had to inspect every single piece of food. Like it would be impossible for you to do that, right? And you wouldn't get out of the grocery store. But you can go to a grocery store and you can
Mhm.
know that you can buy safe food because somebody did that job. And unfortunately, we don't have that somebody yet when it comes to technology. And that's really what we need to make it easier for you. The best you can do right now, I think, where you have the opportunity is to ask those tough questions about, like, where did you get that data? That's a big question for large language models because the answer is, well, we took it from a bunch of artists and we took it from a bunch of illustrators. We didn't really compensate them. So right away, we have like an ethical issue for pretty much every large language model out there. But nobody, but then what? What do you do as a consumer? It's sort of like, well, okay, the options all look not good for me. And so what I say to consumers is ask for better things, and maybe we'll get the fair trade coffee version of things because that's where I think we need to go. But right now, we don't really have it yet. So
Hmm.
I feel for the
Absolutely.
consumer because it's really hard.
And then I think a really interesting angle to also talk about is how AI is starting to, affect people's relationship. Um, and I just wanted to kind of, talk a little bit more about that how is AI impacting, relationships at work, relationships at, maybe in school, maybe at home. What patterns are you starting to kind of see, since you started your journey in AI?
Yeah, so there's a lot that's happening this year in particular as we're a couple of years into this whole era of chatbots. So maybe I'll start with relationships at work. So there's this thing now called work slop. And it's basically this idea that person A in a workplace is going to be pumping out all this AI content. It's not very good content, but they're getting things done and they're handing it off to person B. And person B is like, oh my gosh, this is wrong. I'm going to have to stay overtime to fix this. It's inaccurate and it's just bad. And you can imagine if that happens in your workplace, you're going to have tension between those two people. And that's the kind of thing that's happening. So there's this idea of people using the technology in ways that are inappropriate. And because they probably didn't get trained, they probably, the system landed in their workplace and they just started prompting away. And they weren't really trained on this whole idea of being responsible for your work and ethical oversight of your work and how to use the system well to get good results. So a lot of companies aren't doing that training. But that's the kind of tension that can happen. And that's the kind of thing we need to sort of figure out in the workplace. So that's sort of one issue. Another issue is there's been a lot of stories this year about teen suicides, really sad stories. There's now some lawsuits that have happened from bereaved parents. And basically, what's happened is these large language models, in some cases, they were marketed as companions, make a friend, and basically have a relationship with AI. And some of those relationships have gone very, very wrong. And there's not a lot of guardrails in place up until very recently to protect people from that. And it's not just teens. I've also seen stories of people who say, we started out talking about accounting, and then the next thing you know, I'm going down this dark rabbit hole with this AI system. And so these systems are very good at basically engaging us in conversation. I mean, they don't call them chatbots for nothing. And some of the times that conversation takes a very dark turn. So that's kind of another area. And then the last one I want to comment on is school, because I spend a lot of time in post-secondary as a teacher. And so what's happening in the school is there's the opportunity to use these tools to do something like prompt an essay or produce work that isn't very good. You could maybe call it school slop, kind of the equivalent of work slop. And then as an instructor, you get this and you're like, okay, they haven't said it's AI, but it looks pretty bad. Do I police that? Now you've got an adversarial relationship going on between a teacher and a student. And nobody goes into teaching to have adversarial relationships with their students. So those are just some examples of the way that AI is kind of getting in the middle of different kinds of relationships and causing friction.
Yeah, those are very challenging situations, especially I feel like in school and in the education system, because it's a very unfamiliar territory, both for like students and the schools. So I'm not sure right now they kind of know how to navigate that. Hopefully, in the future, they can kind of like find some ways to, kind of see how to navigate those, because it feels like everybody is using AI, like whether it's, professors, teachers, or the students. But it's just about how much you can use it and then how to use it as well, because I feel like it's kind of where that thing comes in, that you can't really stop people from using AI, so it's all about just how to use it, right?
I mean, I'm gonna say you could stop someone. So here's my pitch for that. I think it's important to think about the context of any situation. If you have a class and you've said, I don't want you to use AI, you have some very good reasons as a teacher for not using AI for an assignment. All of a sudden, so that's a rule. You've said that. I think that there needs to be respect for that particular situation. So I think you can kind of put the rules out there, but I also think that we do need to think about the ideas of how to engage with it well. What would that look like under what circumstances for what tasks? The problem I think becomes like, I'm never an all or nothing kind of a person. I'm never like all one way or all the other way. I'm always kind of in the middle trying to figure out the balance of things. And so I do think there might be some very good reasons why I don't want you to use this for this. It's really important for you to do this other way. And so this time we're not using it. I think that's okay to say that.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of honor that.
Is the essence of this, that there needs to be kind of like a balance. So it doesn't really like speak to, oh, it needs to be one or all, that kind of a thing. Okay, all right. And when it comes to, as we talked about relationships, we there's also people talking about how when any kind of relationships break down because of technology, the repair work is starting to fall on women a lot. So what does that look like? And, are there kind of like any examples that come to mind when we talk about that?
Yeah, so I have a example that I made up for one of the courses that I teach. So I do some work for LinkedIn, and I have a couple of courses where I talk about using AI responsibly in the workplace. And so the example I had was I had one character who just loved AI. He used it everywhere all the time. He was the person producing stuff that might have been called work slop. And then I had another character who was left trying to pick up the pieces, but she didn't want to offend this first person. She was very considerate as a person. She didn't want to offend him. And so what she did is she quietly fixed things in the background. And that's kind of an example of repair work. So somebody who something's broken in an organization, let's say, and somebody else is kind of smoothing. They're doing all that smoothing work. And a lot of times women do that work. We kind of, in some cases, I think culturally have been somehow put into that role a lot more than men. And so we tend to kind of, I don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of times women are called upon to do that kind of work. And so that's the kind of thing that happens whenever there's a breakdown in a situation, relationship, or so forth. There needs to be sort of somebody maybe thinking about the repair work. And that happens a lot in organizations. And it's invisible work, it's unpaid work, and it takes away from other work that you could be doing. And so that's another reason why it's kind of important to think about all of those unpaid, invisible work roles that people might be filling, that might actually be holding them back from doing
Absolutely.
other things.
And then when it comes to women as well, the other thing that I wanted to really talk about, because obviously this is a women empowerment podcast, um, AI, when it comes to AI, how is it, empowering us or disempowering us? And, what should we as women be watching out for?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And it's a complicated question. I think that, like, when I think about empowerment, there are there are abilities that we can have because we have new tools at our disposal to level things up in ways that might be empowering. So, for example, for a lot of my talks, I make little videos. I'm not a video producer, but because I have access to some of these digital tools, some of which have AI capabilities, I can produce something that is not too bad, and then I can augment my work and I can level myself up in some way. And you could have examples of that for different other tasks that people might want to use these tools for. And that's empowering and empowers me as a female business owner to do these kinds of things. So that's, one thing. On the other hand, how we got to make those tools in the first place might be disempowering. So I've already talked to you about data, where it came from. We haven't talked about the environment. There's an environmental cost to using these tools, and it's pretty high. So we need to think about that. And we need to think about bias as well, because sometimes when we're using these tools, they can create biased images or biased word choices. And all of that sort of speaks to that historical bias piece. And so that's disempowering for people. Another way it can be disempowering is going back to our example of the hiring tools, where it's used against you in a way that precludes you getting an opportunity. Now you're shut out from something. Very disempowering. And unfortunately, that is happening in a lot of really high stakes contexts, from who's getting access to loans, for example. So that might be something that, your audience members who might want to start a business and might wonder, why am I not getting offered these loans? It's because perhaps something in the data isn't working well with the algorithmic system in a way that's preventing you from getting that access. So those are the kinds of things where it's kind of both, and it's really complicated because on the one hand you can level up some things, on the other hand
Yeah,
it might
and
be
that just reminds
disempowering
me
you.
of like a LinkedIn post I was reading the other day where a woman, basically she's a creator on LinkedIn, and she was posting about how she kind of was testing out the LinkedIn algorithm, and I think she changed her name to like, a male person, and then she just saw her post like, skyrocket, and yeah, it was like she tested on a level field as well. Yeah, so there was a huge difference in, what she saw, like how her posts were performing. So yeah, that's really interesting because, yeah, we don't really think about those things, right? So
We don't. And the hard part is you don't have a lot of control. And that's the disempowering part too, right? It's sort of like somebody did that to that algorithm in the background somewhere else. And now, you might know that's going on, but what
Mhm.
now, right? And so
So for
that's
women
really
who are
hard.
listening and they want to make sure that they're using AI in empowering ways in their careers, what would be your advice to them?
Well, I think going back to that ask for better I tell everybody that, like, don't settle for what we have. We have a certain thing right now, but there's a lot of problems with it. And I think we need to do better. I think if we're more thoughtful and intentional, and it also goes back to who shapes the technology and who gets to build it, we can get to better places. So number one thing I think for consumers, we live in a capitalist society. Consumers have power, and we can raise our voices and say we don't want to settle for it. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing, when it comes to using the tools, assume that the default is probably going to be biased in some way. So there was a study that showed if you prompt for a CEO, you're going to get a white male face most of the time. If you don't want that, you need to ask for something different. So prompt for diversity. That's another thing that you can do. You can also make sure you're checking and verifying the information that comes out of these tools. So don't just accept that it's accurate because it might not be. And if the stakes are particularly high for that information that you're going to be using, then you need to be extra vigilant in going over that information. And that means you need to be a bit of an expert. So one of the things I say to people, it's tempting to go to these tools and say, I want it to tell me things about the law or things about medicine that I don't know. How are you then going to have oversight over that? How will you verify that with other experts? These are the kinds of things we need to think about, because it's easy enough to verify information when you're the expert. But if you're not the
Mhm.
expert, then how are you going to verify that information? So those are some ways that we can think about using the tools in ways that are safe, and being safe, and doing things in ways that are more, I guess,
Mhm.
reliable.
Exactly.
That is
No, that's
empowering,
very
I
good
think.
advice. And then obviously you're an educator and you've developed different training programs, courses for AI in ethics. Um, why is AI literacy so important for women specifically?
Hmm. Well, I mean, it's important for everyone, of course, because we're all sort of exposed to these tools. But there's kind of an interesting study that came out recently. It was an Angus Reid poll. And it basically said that men are feeling more confident, more familiar, more literate when it comes to AI. So that suggests to me that perhaps we have some catching up to do, perhaps. And so that might be one reason why it's important for women specifically to start closing the gap and becoming more literate when it comes to AI. Though I would argue
Mhm.
we
Definitely,
can all
definitely.
benefit from AI literacy.
And then can you talk a little bit about, what your courses talk about and what are they um, built around, basically?
Sure. So I have a couple of different courses. Well, I'll tell you about the two that I have with LinkedIn first. So the first one that I did was more for people like myself who want to implement a responsible AI program in a workplace. So this is the kind of person who would be tasked with AI governance. So I built a course specifically for that, giving them a bit of a step-by-step framework for how to do that. So that's one of the courses. The other course is for everyone. I call it my ethical AI driver's license. And it's this idea of how do we use generative AI, specifically generative AI, ethically at work. And it talks through various scenarios. I shared one with you already about the two coworkers. And it just shows you, it illustrates, first of all, we start out with the ethical principles and how to make ethical choices, but then we go through some very practical scenarios that illustrate how those choices might show up in a workplace. And that one's been really popular. It launched in January of this year, and we're closing in on close to 50,000 people that have gone through the course already in a year. So it's doing really well. But I also teach at university, and that's a very different experience because you're teaching maybe 10, 15 people at a time. And I have a master's level graduate course, which is really focused on AI from a social justice perspective. And we talk a lot about issues around social justice, representation. We talk about oppression. We talk about the environmental aspects of what it means to build AI systems and how they have a material impact. So that's a very different experience because it's a small group of people. And I usually teach it in the summer. And we basically go through a 6-week process where we learn about the technology, but also how it's impacting people. And so there's that kind of a course. And then I do training and workshops for corporations that sometimes are very tailored to their policies. This is how they're implementing AI, and this is the kind of thing that they want to communicate to their staff. And so we'll do
Mhm.
that kind of a workshop. So it's
Um,
a real range
and
of
then
things.
you've advised with, different kind of whether it's like government or universities, or any kind of other corporations as well. What are the most common challenges that you've seen come up, with advising all these different fields?
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges around what does AI mean in light of privacy. Privacy is really important. I mean, it's important for all kinds of reasons, but one of the reasons why corporations tend to pay more attention is there's actual laws attached to privacy. So we need to really be mindful of what those laws are and are we in compliance and these kinds of questions. So there's a lot of issues around that. There's also issues around bias, which we've already talked about, and particularly when it comes to high stakes scenarios, again, like hiring, which we've covered off a little bit. There's a lot of concerns around making sure we're not discriminating. So again, because there's a legal aspect to that, wanting to be in compliance as well as being ethical. I think that that is something that is really top of mind for organizations. Accountability is another thing that comes up an awful lot. And corporations are always kind of thinking about like in what ways should they be accountable? So it's kind of the positive side of how should we step up? How should we be accountable? But then the negative side would be more along the legal lines of things like what will we be held accountable for if we don't actually do these things? And that could range from cybersecurity issues, kind of going back to privacy and data, to how the tools are used, talking about things like these lawsuits now with these 2 teens and the teen suicide. So there's a whole range of issues related to this notion of accountability. But those are like 3 of the things I would say that are always on the table when we're talking about how to
Mhm.
do AI governance
And
work.
then when it comes to the environmental costs that you mentioned a little bit before, um, so let's talk a little bit about that. How is the environment going to be impacted through AI? I know there's like obviously all these systems that need to be built in place that affects the environment, but can you explain to the audience? And I know it's like a huge topic, but kind of like in a brief way where they kind of get how the environment is going to be impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those like hiding in plain sight moments. So large language model, large, lots of data, lots of processing, lots of computation. And the audience has probably seen stories about data centers. It's definitely a news item that's out there. All of this push to build more data centers. There's all these conversations now about the AI bubble and are we in an AI bubble? And that's partially because these companies are now going into debt. We're talking like $1 trillion debt to build the data centers. Why do we need so many data centers? Well, we have so much computation, so much processing going on. And so that's the challenge. We built something that is a large language model or a large model. We've thrown more data and computation at it to get better results. And all of that has a real material impact. So the data centers need energy to run. That means electricity of some sort. How are we getting the electricity? Sometimes we're burning fossil fuels to get there. So there's that going on. And then we also need to cool the computers, the processors, the servers down. So if you've ever, run your computer for a really long time, it gets super hot. Imagine that happening at scale in a room with lots of servers. That's the kind of thing that happens. And so there's a water need as well. And so when we hear stories about communities who have a water shortage, but all the water has been diverted to serve a data center, or they have an energy shortage, or their prices for energy go up. So as consumers, again, they're sort of like, do you want to see your energy bill go up? All of those kinds of things are connected to the material and the environmental components of these
Mhm.
infrastructures that we
Mhm.
need for the
Yeah, that's
large
a very
language model.
interesting take. Because yeah, I had no idea about the water. I mean, I definitely had heard about like the energy bill going up and data centers being built, like huge data centers, and that also takes into account like obviously you'll need a large part of the land as well, which again goes into deforestation and all those things. But yeah, that's a very interesting take as well about the water shortage. And when it comes to the environmental impact as well, are you seeing any kind of like companies starting to work on that a little bit, or is it like still a work in progress? Yeah.
Um, you mean to address the environmental issues, that kind of thing? Sadly, no. And so the other part of the AI story is we're in a race. So we're in a race with China. We need to win the race, and so there's this whole global race thing. And when you're in a race, all bets are off for doing sustainable things. We just need to do the thing that works, and we need to do it yesterday. And so that's part of the problem. Instead of being thoughtful and more intentional and going, yeah, we need to maybe look at renewable sources and that sort of thing, it's very much full steam ahead and whatever can we spin up today to make this work. And so that is part of the problem. What's really interesting to me is that China actually has done a lot on the renewables question, but they did it because they had to. They did it because they didn't have a lot of fossil fuel reserves, and they knew they needed energy independence. So even though the reasons might not have been the noble, we must be sustainable, they still actually got there faster than we did, which is very interesting to see what's going
Mhm.
on. And that's not to absolve them. They still also
Mhm.
have coal fired power plants and all of that. But because we're in this race to get it done really fast, we've kind of just abandoned a lot of the net zero commitments and responsible, sustainable ways of doing things. And that's
Um,
really
so looking forward to the next couple of years, where do you see this work going when when it comes to ethical AI? What needs to happen in the responsible AI space?
Yeah, I heard something just the other day. I'll share it with you and your listeners, and it really kind of just caught my attention. So one of the people that I pay a lot of attention to is a professor out of Princeton. Her name's Ruha Benjamin, and she's a sociologist. And she was speaking at a big festival, and she said, "We need to make the revolution attractive. We need to have a joyful revolution." And I thought, you that is so spot on. And the reason is you can be the naysayer. You can be the person who's always saying no. And who wants to listen to that person? Who wants to invite that person to the party? Probably not a lot of people. So, how could we actually inspire people to want to do better, to make things better, to create the future that they want to see? And maybe that's the call to action for all your listeners, is that we are all part of that future. We all have a role to play. And so if we don't like things the way they are right now, how can we make them better? And how can we do that in a way where it's so attractive that people want to be part of this solution? They want to join our party. And that really has inspired me to think about what do I want to do in 2026? What does that work look like? And so I'm sitting with that question. I'm pondering it. I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about how do we make this work so attractive that everybody wants to be
And
part of it.
then the last question that I have is, what does empowerment mean to you, especially in the work you're doing right now?
Yeah, I think empowerment for me, it's really about this idea of agency and choice. And so I think about, one of the ethical principles is that we as humans have agency. We have autonomy. We have the ability to make choices. And so what becomes disempowering is when someone else makes the choices for us, and then it shuts down our ability to choose. And so for me, it's really about sort of thinking, how do we open things up in ways that advance people's ability to have agency, to be able to make choices, to give them good options to choose from. That's
Mm.
kind of going back to the fair trade coffee thing. And how do we advance that? How do we do that? How do we open things up? And so, really, for me,
Awesome.
that's what it comes down to.
And again, um, really, really appreciate you coming onto the podcast and talking to our audience about, what it means to use AI responsibly, whether, it's a corporation or an individual, and then what people need to look out for when it comes to using AI as well. And hopefully this can inspire, as we talked about, people to ask for more, as you said, about from AI. Don't settle for the AI that we have right now, and AI literacy as well. So hopefully people can start to educate themselves more about AI, because it's a part of our life now. And if they need to find you, or find your courses on LinkedIn as well, we'll share the links in the description as well. But any summary at the end you want to say to the audience?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think there's a lot here, and I just encourage people to not be overwhelmed. Um, there's a lot going on. There's so much going on, including AI, but there's lots of other things going on too. So it can be overwhelming. But just start where you are and take that first step. I think it's always about, taking that one step forward,
Awesome.
and you can
Thank you
start
so
wherever
much,
you are.
Katrina. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast, and our audience is definitely going to benefit from what we talked about today. And all the best for the work that you're doing. I'm hoping that we'll see more ethically responsible AI in the future. All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
If this episode showed you how AI can actually work for you instead of against you, do me a favor. Share it with someone who's been sitting on the sidelines, afraid to use AI. And if you want more strategies on building multiple income streams with less effort and more intelligence, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Until next time, keep building, keep innovating, and keep staying ahead of the curve.